Madison didn't look me in the eye when she handed me the papers. My daughter had just sold our family's century-old heritage vineyard for $18,500,000. She gave every cent to her husband, Derek, to fund a fraudulent AI-driven real estate platform that didn't exist. Now, they were evicting me. Derek stood in my foyer, holding a court order, claiming I was mentally unfit to hold my own keys. I didn't fight. I simply called my attorney and asked, "Is the bait in place?" At that point, would you have walked away to save your dignity or stayed to see exactly how deep the betrayal went? The study had always been my fortress of logic. I retreated there as the moving trucks vomited Derek's life into mine, leaving the main house to the cacophony of heavy boxes and his loud, self-important directives. From my window, I watched them unpack high-definition monitors and ergonomic chairs, an invasive species of glass and steel, overwhelming the hand-hewn oak and limestone of the estate. Madison was there, drifting through the rooms like a ghost in her own history. Looking back now, I realized she avoided looking up at my window not out of spite, but because she couldn't face the architectural reality of what she had dismantled. It is a peculiar thing to watch your existence being re-archived by people who don't understand the value of the original material. If I'm being honest, I was already entering a state of clinical detachment. I opened my encrypted digital log, a secure file Derek's supposedly visionary eyes hadn't located yet, and began documenting the inventory of the takeover. I noted the time, 2:15 p.m. The hostile acquisition was in full effect. I've spent 40 years as an architect, designing structures meant to withstand tectonic shifts and massive earthquakes. I never realized the most dangerous tremors would come from within my own skull. My focus felt frayed, like a blueprint left out in the rain. I would reach for a memory or a calculation and find only a damp, grey wall. Some things don't break all at once. They fray quietly at the edges until the centre can't hold. Madison appeared at the door 20 minutes later with a cup of Earl Grey. She set it on the corner of my mahogany desk, her fingers trembling against the porcelain. "You need to rest, Dad," she whispered, her voice lacking its usual resonance. "Derek says the stress of the sale is finally catching up to you. He thinks you should let us handle the estate decisions for a while." I looked at her, searching for the daughter who used to ride on my shoulders through the vine rows. All I saw was a woman trapped in a script she didn't write. She left before I could ask her why the tea smelled faintly metallic, something like iron and unwashed chemicals. Later that evening, after the house grew quiet and the new occupants retreated to the master suite that used to be mine, I went down to the kitchen. I wasn't looking for a snack. I was looking for a variable. Tucked behind the artisanal honey jars in the pantry, I found a small amber glass bottle without a commercial label. "Natural Vitality Drops," the handwritten sticker read. I held it up to the moonlight, filtering through the window, noting the viscous, cloudy liquid inside. It wasn't an herbal supplement. It was a chemical audit of my autonomy, and my own daughter was the one presiding over the ledger. 40 years of labour reduced to a digital ledger. Looking back now, I see the irony of my own design. I spent decades reinforcing the foundations of this estate, ensuring the cellars could withstand a century of shifting earth. But I left the emotional supports of my own family uninspected. I remember the frost of 1988. I spent 3 consecutive nights in the lower fields, the wind machines screaming against a plummeting thermometer while my skin cracked under the weight of the Sonoma winter. I did it because the soil has no concept of a weekend or a holiday. It only recognizes the presence of the one who tends it. At the time, I didn't realize that my relentless desire to provide was creating a vacuum where Madison's resilience should have been. I wanted her to inherit the light of this legacy, without ever having to acknowledge the shadow of the work required to sustain it. If I'm being honest, I had been the only silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a subscription to happiness that they hadn't truly earned. It took me years to understand that by removing the friction of reality from her life, I had made her the perfect host for a predator like Derek. He didn't love the land. He loved the leverage it provided. Derek is a man of disruptive visions, but he has never once had dirt under his fingernails that wasn't from a designer potted plant. To him, the heritage vineyard is just another asset to be optimized, a collection of high-value liquid units to be traded for his next imaginary empire. He views my silence as a surrender, a tactical retreat into the senility he's been trying to manufacture with those amber drops in my tea. The betrayal reached its logical conclusion at 11:45 p.m. I was sitting in the darkness of the study, the only light coming from the hidden interface of my laptop. A notification pinged a direct alert from the estate's inventory management system. Madison had just authorized the bulk liquidation of the 1996 private reserve. That was the year she was born, the vintage I had set aside to be the cornerstone of her future. It wasn't just wine to us, it was a physical record of the year this legacy gained its heir. Watching that digital confirmation was like seeing a piece of my own skeleton being sold for scrap. They were burning the library to heat the house, and they hadn't even bothered to read the books first. The liquidation was a mistake, not just an emotional one, but a legal one that Derek hadn't accounted for in his arrogance. Isolation is the architect's most effective tool for demolition. Derek was performing for a curated audience of his peers on Friday evening, a high production value display of domestic tragedy. He spent the night leaning over my shoulder, speaking to me in that slow, clinical rhythm one reserves for a toddler or a broken appliance. He told the table how I used to be sharp and visionary, his voice heavy with a manufactured grief that cost him nothing. Looking back now, I realized this was the moment he was finalizing the architecture of my social erasure. By labeling my quiet observation as mental withdrawal, he was turning me into a stranger in my own zip code. That's when I realized some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. As long as I was the bank, I was the patriarch. The moment I became the obstacle, I was a liability to be managed. Madison was the primary tool in this process. She sat across from me, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She had become the middle manager of my dehumanization, carrying out Derek's orders under the guise of caring for my health. This is the mechanics of normalized cruelty. It doesn't start with a punch, it starts with a concern. It is a slow erosion of boundaries where the abuser convinces the victim that their autonomy is actually a burden. Derek had convinced Madison that every time he silenced me, he was protecting my dignity. It's a psychological transaction where the currency is guilt, and Madison was hopelessly overdrawn. After the guests departed, Derek cornered me in the study. He laid a thick stack of legal documents on my desk. "A full power of attorney, Franklin," he said, his smile tight and predatory. He gestured to a corrupt notary waiting in the foyer to rubber stamp the theft. "For tax protection, Franklin, we've used your medical instability to bypass the Heritage Trust's standard protections." Madison stood behind him, clutching a handkerchief like a prop. "Please, Dad," she sobbed. "Just sign it so you can rest. We just want to take the weight off your shoulders." The weight they were referring to was the 40 years of labour under my fingernails. To them, I was a failing server that needed to be replaced by a more efficient operating system. They looked at me and saw a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and now they were demanding the collateral. I looked at the document. It was a total surrender of my life's work. I picked up my vintage fountain pen, the one with the gold nib I'd used to sign every major contract for 4 decades. Derek leaned in, his breath smelling of my own 1996 private reserve, his eyes gleaming with the heat of a man who thought he had reached the final score. I signed the document with a steady, clinical hand. I didn't tell him that I had swapped the cartridge an hour earlier for a specific ink used in textile, marking one that would be dark and official for 12 hours before vanishing into a blank, meaningless sheet of paper. Trust is a liability when you're being audited. I met Robert at 3:15 a.m. in a sterile satellite office, far from the vineyard, a space of white light and cold data that Derek's digital visionary eyes had no way of tracking. Robert didn't offer coffee. He offered a manila folder that felt heavier than the limestone blocks of my cellar. He slid a copy of the quitclaim deed Derek had used to secure that massive loan. My signature at the bottom was a masterpiece, the precise weight of the pen, the specific flourish of the F I'd developed over 40 years of blueprints. But it was a digital ghost. A high-level forensic forgery created by a hand that had never felt the resistance of actual paper. Looking back now, I realized that Derek wasn't just stealing my property. He was rewriting my identity into a narrative of decline. Robert then handed me a pair of headphones. "Since you are the primary owner of the family's digital sharing plan, we didn't need a warrant to access these backups," he said, his voice as clinical as a surgeon's. I listened. It was my voice. I sounded frail, confused, whispering to my daughter that I was losing my way and that she should trust Derek with everything. If I'm being honest, hearing that digital phantom made my skin crawl. It wasn't me, but to a daughter already primed by fear, it was the only truth she had left. This was the architecture of her entrapment, the invisible chains of a survivor. At the time, I didn't realize that Madison wasn't an accomplice out of greed, but out of a desperate, manufactured necessity. Derek had built a house of mirrors around her, using AI voice cloning to ensure that ever she reached for her father, she only touched a simulation designed to drive her further into his arms. Survivors of this kind of psychological siege don't always run. They often just try to find a North Star in the fog. Derek had simply provided a fake star. The final confirmation came from the high-definition hidden camera I'd installed in the kitchen crown moulding 3 days prior. We watched the monitor in the silence of the office. There was Derek, silhouetted by the moonlight in his silk robe, moving with the practiced efficiency of a chemist. He took the amber bottle from behind the honey jars and meticulously added exactly 3 drops into my evening glass of Cabernet. He didn't look guilty. He looked like a man performing a routine maintenance check on a piece of machinery he intended to decommission. I sat there, watching my own slow-motion murder caught in 1080p resolution. Anger wasn't loud. It was a cold calculation. I looked at Robert and saw the same grim satisfaction in his eyes. We didn't need a shouting match or a physical confrontation. We had a high-definition record of the crime, and the clock on Derek's empire was about to run out of minutes. The gala was a masterpiece of artificial vanity. Derek had rented a massive white tent, hired a professional string quartet, and uncorked my 1996 private reserve without a second thought. He stood at the centre of the lawn, a self-appointed king of a kingdom he hadn't yet officially stolen. I walked into the light at exactly 7:45 p.m., wearing the tuxedo I'd purchased for my own architectural retrospectives. I wasn't the shuffling, confused shell he had been presenting to the valley's social elite. I was an architect performing a final structural audit. Looking back now, I see that I hadn't just built a winery, I had built a stage for a predator. Derek tried to intercept me, his hands like iron clamps on my shoulders, his voice a condescending stage whisper. "Franklin, you shouldn't be here. The music is too loud for your condition." I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him. I simply walked to the primary projection screen, meant for his visionary business pitch, and tapped a single command on my encrypted phone. The screens didn't show his digital roadmap. They showed the high-definition infrared footage from my kitchen crown moulding. The room went cold as 300 people watched Derek, silhouetted by the moon, meticulously adding those amber drops into my evening wine. Then I switched the audio to the raw deepfake files. The crowd heard his AI-generated simulation of my voice admitting to senility, followed immediately by the unedited recording of Derek laughing about moving me to a facility 2 states away once the $18,500,000 hit his offshore accounts. A borrowed shadow has no weight once the sun moves. I realised then that Derek's authority was never internal. It was a projection onto the canvas of my reputation and my daughter's misplaced loyalty. This is the tragedy of the empty wallet visionary. They believe their borrowed status is permanent until the landlord changes the locks. He had been the temporary tenant of my prestige, and his lease had just expired. If I'm being honest, watching the room realise his true nature felt less like a triumph and more like a necessary demolition. The investors Derek thought he was courting were actually the 7 members of the Heritage Trust Board and a team of forensic investigators Robert had embedded weeks ago. Derek's face didn't turn red. It turned the colour of damp ash. He looked at the board members, then at the uniformed officers, standing at the edge of the tent, realising he was being audited in a room full of people who understood the mathematics of his fraud. A process server stepped through the crowd, handing him 2 folders, one for a massive civil suit and one for a criminal warrant for elder abuse. The quartet stopped playing mid-measure. The only sound left was the wind through the vines and the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who realised his subscription to my life had been cancelled without the possibility of a refund. Madison sat in the front row, her face a mask of total devastation, as she finally heard the original recording of her husband's plan to dispose of us both. She didn't scream, she simply collapsed, her body hitting the grass, as the mirrors of Derek's house of lies finally shattered into 1,000 pieces. Justice is a slow, cold process of filtration. The legal machinery didn't need my anger, it only required the data I had meticulously archived. Derek's bluster didn't survive the first week of discovery once Robert and the forensic team began their audit. His offshore accounts were a house of cards that collapsed by the following Tuesday at 11 a.m. He wasn't a visionary. He was a predictable pattern of entitlement. He eventually took a plea deal 10 years in a state facility for felony elder abuse and grand larceny. He lost every asset, every tailored suit, and every shred of the status he had tried to weaponize against me. I watched him being led from the courtroom and felt no surge of triumph. Looking back now, I realise that anger is a high-maintenance emotion that I can no longer afford to fund. It took me years to understand that the truest form of power isn't the ability to crush an enemy. It's the ability to reach a point where you no longer care if they exist. Accountability is simply the final line in a ledger that had been unbalanced for far too long. Madison was the collateral damage of her own blind spots. She was left penniless. The $18,500,000 she had invested in Derek's ghost companies, having vanished into the ether of digital crime. She spent 3 weeks in a hotel she couldn't afford before she appeared at the iron gates of the winery, her life reduced to 2 battered suitcases and a look of profound, silent shame. I didn't open those gates with a hug or a speech about forgiveness. I opened them with a legal settlement. She could work as a junior labourer to earn her restitution or face the conspiracy charges the district attorney was ready to file. I told her she could stay, but not in the main house, and certainly not as the heiress to the Heritage Vineyard. She was assigned a small cabin meant for the seasonal picking crews, and a position as a junior labourer in the North Fields. Legacy isn't a gift you receive in a velvet box. It's the dirt under your fingernails and the salt on your skin. If I'm being honest, I had failed her by making her original path too smooth. Now, she would have to learn the architecture of work from the foundation up. We exist now in a state of clinical, necessary distance. She works the vines under the strict supervision of the estate manager, learning the language of the soil she once tried to sell. I watch her from my study window, observing the daughter I once knew, slowly emerging from the wreckage of the woman she had become. It isn't reconciliation, it is reconstruction, one vine at a time. The soil has finally returned to its natural balance. I spend my mornings in the north garden now, far from the digital noise Derek tried to install within these limestone walls. The silence here isn't empty. It is the quiet of a structure that has finally settled into its bedrock. Looking back now, I realize that my 40 years of blueprints were just a rehearsal for this specific clarity. I look at the vineyard, and I don't see $1 million asset or a line item on a ledger anymore. I see 40 years of sun and rain, preserved by a single, clinical decision to stop being a silent investor in my own destruction. Some think revenge is a fire that consumes the enemy, but I've learned it's actually a frost one that clears the weeds so the true vine can finally breathe again. It is a biological necessity. In agriculture, as in family, you cannot save the harvest if you are unwilling to prune the parasitic growth. Derek was a weed of the most sophisticated variety, one that used the language of vision to mask the reality of theft. But a borrowed shadow has no weight once the sun moves, and his shadow has been permanently erased from this valley. I used the $2 million recovered from the Cayman accounts, a mere fraction of the $18,500,000 Derek liquidated to establish the Sonoma Heritage Foundation, a non-profit that doesn't focus on wine, but instead provides legal and psychological audits for seniors facing financial gaslighting. It is the sower's justice taking the remains of a crime and using them to plant a new kind of shelter. If I'm being honest, it is the most meaningful structure I have ever designed. Madison remains in the fields. She has stopped asking for the keys to the main house. She has stopped looking at the winery as a birthright to be traded for a higher status. Last Tuesday, I stood at the edge of the north field and watched her work. Her hands were stained with grape juice and earth, the skin rough, her movements heavy with the fatigue of actual labour. It was the first time in 10 years I recognised my daughter. I am at peace with the distance between us. It is the only thing keeping the structural integrity of our lives from failing again. Derek is a number in a state facility, and my daughter is a labourer in my fields. I am at peace here, among the vines that survive the frost. I am no longer the silent investor in someone else's drama. I am the architect of my own peace, and for the first time in a century, the heritage of this land belongs to the one who truly understands its value. I'd like to hear your perspective. Have you ever had to make a hard choice to protect what you spent your whole life building?